Good evening, everybody. Hopefully everyone can hear me. I don't think we had any music on our lovely little intro. Apologies for that. But I'm Betsy Fischer Martin and the Executive Director of the Women in Politics Institute here at American University. And welcome to our virtual series, Women on Wednesdays. We are glad you are here to join us tonight. To those of you new to our events, WPI is a nonprofit and nonpartisan institute in AU's School of Public Affairs. And our mission is to close the gender gap in political leadership. And we offer academic courses. We do a campaign training program called We Lead for young women who want to run for office. And we facilitate research and discussions like this on women in politics. And so tonight we are excited to be joined by two leading scholars from the University of Notre Dame, whose research helps us better understand not just the role of women in politics, but how their presence on the political stage shapes the next generation. David Campbell and Christina Wolbrecht are the co-authors of See Jane Run: How Women Politicians Matter for Young People. It's a terrific and timely book that explores what happens when young people, especially young women, see women in political leadership. Spoiler alert, it matters a lot. Drawing from new data and years of research, they show that when girls and boys see women run for office and lead, it shapes their political beliefs, their civic engagement, and even their career ambitions. And the effects are more than symbolic. They are lasting and they are measurable. So tonight we're going to dig into some key questions that their book raises. And of course, we will save plenty of time for your questions. On the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A button. So if during the course of our discussion you have a question, please go ahead and enter it there. So David and Christina, welcome. Thanks for being here.
Our pleasure.
Dave, yeah, of course. Dave, I'm going to turn it over to you in just a minute to give us kind of a top line summary of the book. But I first wanted to just share with everybody a few photos that I think we will all recognize that will frame our discussion tonight. So the first one, of course, is this iconic image that we remember from 2024 of Kamala Harris accepting the nomination at the Democratic Convention, and there's her two nieces in the background taken by a New York Times photographer. So, and her tweet there, of course, to go along with it. I want every little girl across our country to know this. You can do anything, even if it's never been done before. And then, of course, we had Nikki Haley, who also ran for president for the Republican nomination. And this is just one of many pictures of her with teenage girls. And this is an article from the state newspaper in South Carolina about her becoming an idol for young girls in 2024. And then Hillary Clinton, of course, in 2016, after she lost, to all the little girls watching, never doubt that you are valuable and powerful and deserving of every chance and opportunity in the world. And Geraldine Ferraro, 1984. Christina and Dave, you all mentioned this in the book, and it's kind of a real starting point for women in politics. And I think the three of us kind of came into our teenage years during this time period, and I think it was probably very memorable and impactful for all of us as well. So with that, I just wanted to turn it over to David, who's going to give us a few minutes of an overview of the book. I know you have some slides as well, and then I'll have a couple of follow-up questions, and then we'll take it from there with hopefully some audience questions.
Well, wonderful. It's great to be here. I appreciate the invitation from the WPI and I noticed in the opening montage, I have always referred to this institution as American University, but I saw a sign that identified it as the American University. So I will be sure to identify it.
I think we answered either.
You're not like Ohio State? You haven't trademarked?
Right.
Well, thank you very much for that generous introduction, Betsy. Sure. I, along with Christina, we're here to talk a little bit about this book of ours. And I'm just going to give a brief overview of some of the things that we find in the book or ask in the book, and then I'll hand it over to Christina. But to kick things off, I thought I would share the origin story of this book. And Geraldine Ferraro is actually an important part of this story. And you'll notice behind me, I actually have a poster from Geraldine Ferraro's campaign in 1984. That is not a reproduction, that is the real thing.
Wow.
And it's I think, a nice segue into what got us started working on this topic. Christina, could you move to the first slide?
I'm gonna find out. There we go.
Many, many years ago, when I was in graduate school, I was working with some data from a data set called Monitoring the Future. This is a massive study. It is done every year. It involves surveys of high school students, and it's mostly about their use of drugs and alcohol and those sorts of things. But in addition to those kinds of questions, this data set also asks whether or not young people are interested in politics or whether they see themselves as politically engaged. And what you're looking at is a graph that shows adolescents, so high school students' political engagement from 1976 all the way up to the early 2000s. And of course, one thing you'll notice is that the lines are going down for both boys and girls. But there are two interesting moments of divergence where you see the line for girls going up while the line for boys remains downward. In fact, Christina, could you flip to the next slide just so we can point that out? The first of those points in time is right after Geraldine Ferraro was the first woman to run on a major party ticket, of course, as Walter Mondale's running mate. And the second was immediately following 1992, which of course is known as the Year of the Woman for the record number of women who ran for Congress that year. This was very interesting to me. And eventually Christina and I ended up working together at Notre Dame. And I asked her whether she was aware of anybody ever having written on this idea that maybe young people and young girls in particular get more interested in politics when they see women run for office. Seems from this graph like there's something to that idea. And we looked into it, and yeah, it'd been a little bit done, but not much. But we decided that we would sort of sink our teeth into this question. And we actually published a paper with the same title as the book, See Jane Run, which kicked off what has now been almost a 20-year research enterprise as we've investigated what we call the role model effect. What happens to young people, both boys and girls, actually. What happens to young people when they see women run for office? And so in order to frame all of this, I'm going to take just a couple of minutes, I promise, and lay out the research questions we're interested in and then the theoretical foundations. Then I'll hand it over to Christina and she'll talk a little bit about what we found. So Christina, could you flip to the next slide where you will see our continuing motif of the Dick and Jane books, because we just couldn't resist leaning into this motif of these children's books about seeing Jane run. The big picture here is we're interested in a series of research questions. Does the presence of women politicians, so when women run for office, does that influence, first, beliefs about women's capacity for leadership? Do young people become more likely to see women capable of holding elected office, governing an office? Are they fit to rule? Second, does the presence of women politicians change young people's beliefs about the political system itself? Do they see the political system as being more responsive? Basically, do they see democracy working? And then thirdly, and this really was the question that kicked it all off from those spikes in 1984 or 1992, do women politicians influence the political engagement of young people, and maybe young girls in particular, including their ambition for office? Do they envision themselves running for office one day? And if we're talking about women politicians as role models, that is the quintessential example of a role model. You see a woman run, if you yourself are a woman, you think, well, maybe I could do that. Maybe that's something that is a possibility for me. And if we're talking about teenagers, it means they're looking forward and imagining themselves as an adult. Is running for office something that might be in their future? Now, these were our research questions. But if you look across multiple scholarly literatures, there's actually a lot of reason to think that we would find evidence for this role model effect. And just to give you a taste of where we are looking for support for this idea, first, we draw on the work of political philosophers, that is, those who write on democratic theory, that have written that when women run for office, we might very well think that citizens view government as more representative, more responsive, more fair. And interestingly, this literature focuses not only on what happens to the have-nots, and in this case, that would be women, but also the haves or men. Do men change their views of who's fit to rule? We're interested in that question. Secondly, we draw on a literature in psychology that is called social role theory, and it looks at the fact that when we have the overrepresentation of men in political roles, although this actually applies to all sorts of professions, but specifically in politics, does that communicate that politics is not an appropriate role or an appropriate place for women? And then contra that, when women run, and therefore they're running counter to this overrepresentation of men, does that lead to a change in attitudes? And then lastly, we draw on a literature in our own discipline of political science, which has found that the presence of women politicians can, at least under some conditions, draw interest and attention. It can spur engagement and help close that gender gap. And our work definitely contributes to that literature, although our contribution is that we are focusing on young people and what happens in those impressionable years when one is going through their formative period of political socialization. So with that in mind, I've laid out our research questions, why we think there's something to this idea. I'm going to pass it off to Christina, who'll tell us a little bit about what we've actually found in the book.
Yeah, so we want to make sure we have lots of time for engagement with those of you in the audience and to talk about the kind of questions you might have. But we thought we'd give you just a taste. One of the things that people who've read this book come away saying is, my goodness, there's a lot of data and a lot of findings. So we're hoping to give you a few major findings and sort of spark your interest in the broader project. So one of the things we do in this book is really try to focus in on when should we expect women politicians to play this role of inspiring, of changing how we think about women's ability to do politics, for changing people's views of democracy. And we really sort of note a number. There's really mixed findings in this area in the past. And what we're trying to do is sort of make sense of all of that and think about, where should we expect to see women as role models? And so, as Dave just mentioned, we think particularly it's important to be looking at young people. If an old, cynical woman like myself sees one more woman run for office, probably doesn't change my views dramatically or my political interest. But for younger people who are really coming into and learning about the political system, we really think that they're the audience, again, because of psychologists have told us for a long time, these are really the impressionable years when we're really shaping our views about politics. We also focus specifically on candidates, so women as candidates rather than women as office holders. The idea is simply that that's what campaigns are. They're reaching out to people, and if we think young people are going to be affected by women in politics, it's probably most likely to happen when these women are directly reaching out to the public. Similarly, we're really interested in women's visibility. Again, for women to impact the way that the public feels about politics, they have to actually be visible. And so we look at women candidates for major offices like the Senate, governor's offices, etc. Along those same lines, it helps if those women candidates are viable. So if you're this sacrificial lamb in a district where the incumbent's going to win by 80%, probably that woman challenger isn't making a big difference in how people see politics. But when women are competitive or win, but I should say either one works. You don't have to win to have the impacts that we find in our book. That's when we think they're going to make an impact on how adolescents understand politics. It helps, ironically, if women are path breaking. Maybe they're running for an office that's already held by a man. Maybe it's 1992 or 2008, 2018. And lots of people are talking about how many women are in politics, et cetera. Those are the times when we sort of emphasize how path-breaking and novel these women are, that they have the biggest impact. And finally, in the book, we talk a lot about whether or not you literally, if we ask you, do you know if any women ran, right? Are you actually consciously aware that there are women running in your district or your state? Is that necessary for women to have an impact? Or is it enough that you're just sort of out there in the zeitgeist, that we're just aware that there seem to be more women in politics? And so that's another thing we explore in the book. So we just want to again give you some top line findings and sort of what we see as an important conclusions from this book. And so Dave laid out those 3 questions. In terms of beliefs about women's capacity for leadership, we actually find it is among Republicans, both girls and boys, who become much more positive about women's capacity to be leaders when they're exposed to actual women candidates, Democrats or Republicans. We kind of think of this as both Democratic boys and girls, if you look at the data, have sort of reached a ceiling. They're already pretty positive about women as political leaders. But what we see is that exposure to women politicians helps their Republican boys and Republican girls sort of catch up with where Democrats are. It's not just their beliefs about women leaders, but we also include measures of just sexism, and exposure to women politicians leads Republican young people to become less sexist. In terms of beliefs about the political system, we find that in general, girls become more positive about the political system. They're more likely to see it as representative, as speaking to what people actually need, et cetera. We see this in a lot of our sort of normal studies. We've also seen this in some earlier work we did on the impact of 2016 and 2018, right? So in 2016, we have the first woman running for, nominee of a major party. Dave and I certainly were paying close attention. Boy, we've been studying these role models for a long time. What happens when there's a woman at the top of the ticket? Of course, Clinton loses in 2016. And what we're able to see in our data is that Democratic girls in particular become very negative about the political system. They don't think it's representative, right? They've seen how Clinton was treated. They see her lose to someone that they probably see as less qualified, et cetera. And we really see sort of a falling off in girls' confidence, Democratic girls' confidence in the political system. But of course, I'm guessing that most of the folks here know what happened next. So in 2018, we get this huge increase, partly fueled by organizations like Women Lead that Betsy already mentioned, in women running for office. And sure enough, what our data show is that after 2018, those same Democratic girls rebound. That seeing this response where women sort of take up the challenge to run for office, in part in response to what happened in 2016, leads Democratic girls to sort of reclaim their confidence in democracy, their belief that democracy can be representative. Which again, I think the conclusion there is, women politicians matter. They're having these very direct impacts on the way in which young women are understanding politics and the political world. And finally, in terms of political engagement, and that's everything from, do you think you're going to vote when you get older? Do you think you'll write a letter to your member of Congress? Do you think that you'll go to a protest or a campaign event? What kind of ambition? And in addition, including, do you imagine yourself even running for office someday? Interestingly, what we find is that both Democratic girls and Republican boys become more engaged in politics, including saying they plan to vote, when they see women running. And that might sound like a little bit of a puzzle. One of the interesting things we're able to do in the book is sort of dig a little deeper on this finding. And what we discover is that when Democratic girls see women politicians, they think, I could do politics, right? Their belief, like, this is something I'm able to do. And it's that belief that sort of generates this engagement, I can do it, and therefore, yes, I do think I'm going to go to campaign events or whatever it might be when I grow up. Republican boys, however, don't have that same sort of inspiration. They're not saying, oh, yes, I didn't believe I could do politics and now I can. Rather, we sort of hypothesize and show that Republican boys feel more threatened, that they're saying, yes, I'm going to be engaged in politics because they view this increase in women in what have been traditional male roles as something of a threat. And so they respond to that by being politically engaged. We're also able to do some really in-depth looking at women of color. And we find that Black girls are especially inspired by Black women candidates, much more than they are by white women candidates. And I should say, even white girls find Black women candidates particularly inspiring, that there's something about overcoming double barriers that young girls really find inspiring and getting them engaged, wanting them to be engaged in politics. Finally, or close to finally, we wanted to look at this question about, do role models persist, right? So when Elizabeth Warren was making pinky promises with little girls in the 2020 campaign trail, when Kamala Harris says, girls, you can do anything, when Nikki Haley talks about how important it is for girls to see her as a woman of color that is running as a Republican and can have this role. They're interested in the girls themselves, but of course what they're interested in is seeding this sort of interest in politics that will then take girls into their adulthood, right? It is adults that we then have the opportunity to shape the world around us through voting and activism and even running for office. And so we are actually the first to have data that lets us speak to this question. If when you were an adolescent, you were exposed to women running for office, what does that mean for you when you become an adult? And we find that girls who are exposed to these women as adolescents are in fact more likely to vote as adults. That effect is largely a compensation effect, by which I mean we mostly see this among girls who grow up in families where there's not a lot of political discussion. And so their turnout expectations were pretty low. But if they're exposed to women, if they're in these districts where women are running, they're able to overcome that, they didn't get the support there and become more engaged in politics. So a very large slide, kind of summarizing our findings, but again, we're happy to come back to these and talk about details, et cetera. When women candidates are visible, viable, and novel, they have these real impacts on how boys and girls, Republican and Democrat, understand the political system, their confidence in democracy, and their willingness to come into politics and shape their futures as well. And so with that, we just want to again thank American University for the opportunity to present our research, and we very much look forward to your questions.
I believe, Christina, we thank the American
University.
I'm
sorry.
Either way is fine. Thank you both. That was really very comprehensive and just really set it up perfectly. And I know we already have some questions coming in. I wanted to ask just a few, and then we'll go to the audience questions. I always joke and say, it will be great one day when we don't have to have a Women in Politics Institute, right? Like when it's not novel and new anymore, and it's just, yeah, whatever, right? So does that role model effect end as more women actually hold office? What did you find there?
We're looking at each other like, who wants to answer this one? So that's something that we, Betsy, think a lot about.
Yeah.
Even in the 20 years that Dave and I have been doing research like this, the number of women running for political office has skyrocketed dramatically. And so in a very real way, our research would suggest that as women become more normal, if they're not the first woman to ever run for that office, if they're not always running against a man because that's who all the incumbents are, that we actually would expect that eventually younger children grow up and think this is something both boys and girls do. So some of the political scientists on the call will know there's great research on with very young children asking them to draw a political leader. When they're very young, the girls draw girls and the boys draw boys. And as they get older and learn more about the world, everybody draws a boy because they've learned that this is what politics is for. But as our world changes, as our children and our children's children live in a world that looks different, I think we can expect that at that very young, important age, that socialization will be changing.
Yeah, another way to think of it, just to build on what Christina said, is as more women run for office, we are essentially putting ourselves out of business because
Right.
now,
Mhm.
given that women are underrepresented, we can find this role model effect
That's
because
right.
when women run, they get a lot of attention, and that
Right.
triggers the attention of the young people. As more and more women run, they will cease to be notable or novel. And so we would not expect to find the kind of effects we report in this book. But that doesn't mean the women aren't role models. It just means their role modeling has permeated the culture so that you don't pick it up over here when this person runs or over here when there's a white
Right.
person running. It's just part of the package that of beliefs that people have in the culture.
The
Right.
way we
Because you
say that
also,
is,
yeah.
I'm just going to
Right.
say, men are already role models.
Yeah.
They're just already telling boys, this is what boys get to do. We're just going to have more women who are telling girls, you get to do this too.
Right. Because you also mentioned sort of the visibility component, right, along with it, because, the media attention that goes along. I mean, how many news articles do we read? The first woman governor, the first woman mayor, the first this, the first that, right? This is what reporters are drawn to. No one writes, the plane landed safely, right? And so you're saying kind of once that novelty wears off, we won't see as much of this.
Just to be clear, I think
Yeah.
we're definitely moving in the direction where women won't be as novel.
Yeah.
I am not really worried about being unemployed from this work for a couple more decades, right? We have yet to have a woman president. We're
Right.
still at less than 30% in the Senate and the House. So absolutely. And that has always, we mentioned these Democratic theorists, that has always been their argument that one of the things that representation does is signals the openness of a political system and how important that is to democracy.
Right.
We're much better than we used to be. We still have a way to go.
Right. There's this great quote that you guys also mentioned in the book, which you can't be what you can't see, from Marian Wright Edelman, of course, and it's one of my favorite quotes. But I'm thinking back to sort of, you mentioned the presidency as kind of, it's the big kahuna, right? We haven't gotten there yet. And I always talk about, the placemat, like when you're growing up and you have the plastic placemat as a kid of all the US presidents and it's all men, like that sends a message, right? A very clear message. And like, are we going to get on that placemat one day? But talk about the role of the presidency, sort of that last big vestige. And, I know the research of the book you all did, and you mentioned this in the preface, you did during the campaign, so after the results of the election, but how, and you also say that it doesn't matter if you win or not, you just have to be viable and out there. But when it comes to the presidency, how much of a setback is it when we have had two women as Democratic nominees, neither of which has been able to win?
You ask a very good question, and I will do my best to answer, and Christina no doubt will have profound thoughts as well. But I should note that our book is not about the presidency.
Right.
We focus on these other offices, and the reason for that is simply that the presidency as a national office doesn't give us any variation in any given election, because if Hillary Clinton is running for office, she's running nationwide. Whereas if we're looking at senators or members of the House, there's variation across the country.
Mm-hmm.
But that's a cop-out. Of course, we care about the presidency. And that's why, as Christina mentioned, we were very interested as scholars of the role model effect of what would happen with a woman in 2016 at the top of the ticket. And we did find, contrary to the other data that we've collected on lower level offices, that Hillary Clinton's loss did have an effect on at least Democratic girls' attitudes, as Christina was saying. And why was that? Well, because it's the presidency, right? This is an office unlike any other. The Senate is one thing, the House is another thing. The presidency, obviously transcends all of that. The question of whether or not the combination of Hillary Clinton's loss and Kamala Harris's loss is, sort of double indemnity, that is unresolved. But it's interesting, as Christina noted, we do find this rebound in Democratic girls' attitudes following Hillary Clinton's loss. And in another
Mhm.
paper, we actually don't get into this in the book, but another work we've done, we actually also show that those Democratic girls became more likely to see themselves protesting. And the reason we think is because there were other role models out there marching in the streets and demonstrating ways to be politically active. So to the extent that in the wake of Kamala Harris's loss and everything that we're experiencing now, we see more examples for young people, and maybe especially young girls, of ways that they can be politically engaged, well, then we might actually see an increase in their political engagement and interest coming out of the 2024 election.
Yeah. And I mean, this isn't necessarily something in the book, but I feel like I'm constantly asked about this question is, does the fact that Kamala Harris lost, does that mean we're not going to be any closer to electing a woman as president, right? Like, do we see now, the Democrats won't nominate a woman? I guess that's a whole nother book, but it's just something that, I'm constantly asked about too, is like, how much of a setback was this for actually having a woman run for office? But Christina, let me ask you also, because, back to Geraldine Ferraro, you also talk about this notion of role models as being enduring and not fleeting. It stays with you. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Well, to bring it back to where you sort of started it,
Yeah.
we tell the story in the book that one of my earliest memories is when I was 14, my father came home from work one day and told me that he'd gone to a rally and shaken hands with Geraldine Ferraro. And I had a very politically engaged childhood, but this really stands out. Like, it was a big deal, right? And I can't claim that's why I'm a political scientist who studies gender, but it's probably not unrelated to these sorts of things. And so there are lots of forces acting on us as we are growing up and learning about everything about the world around us, right? There are our families, there are teachers and coaches, there are our religious tradition or religious practices, right? But we're also looking out at the even broader world, a world that is probably more in our kids' faces today than it's been ever. And trying to understand, like, that's the job of childhood. What do people like me do? Like, what's a good thing to do? What's not? How do I act? How do I behave? What beliefs do I have? And so it's hard to study adolescence. And so we were really pleased to be able to bring this much data together. You can't just walk up to kids and ask them questions without their parents' permission. But then to be able to trace those kids to when they grow up is even harder. Young people go all over the place, right? And so it's been hard to sort of see that impact. And the fact that we found some data where we could, data I should mention that was produced and kept by the Department of Education Center for Education Statistics, which has recently been eliminated. But that data finally let us sort of look at this question. And so lots of things are going to affect whether you vote as an adult. But early on, being put on a path to see this is something that people like you do is something we have every reason to think is going to kind of stay with us for the rest of our lives. Voting is also a habit. So if you help people vote right away when they're become old enough or early in their lives, they are more likely to keep voting as time goes on.
How do you all, or how would you like political parties, activists, people who work in the field of getting more women elected office, how would you like them to use your findings to encourage more women to run for office? What's the takeaway that would be valuable there?
I'm going to answer that question. I also peeked at some of the other questions, and this will be a perfect opportunity to answer sort of some of the questions that are coming in. There are a lot of different ways, a lot of different reasons why we might think, from a normative perspective, what is best, that we should have more women in political office. That might just be, look, in terms of fairness, if we really believe that everyone's got a shot, or most people have a shot to sort of play this role of speaking for the people, and women are systematically lesser everywhere, then probably there's something about the selection process that's not fair. And we should make sure that political power is available to everyone. That's what a democracy means. We all have equal power. right? So that might be the reason.
Mhm.
The reason might be that we know that when women get into office, there's piles of research on this, that there are ways in which they are different kinds of representatives. They frame questions differently. Their constituent service is, most research that suggests, better. They maybe bring up issues that weren't being raised before, right? Our medical bills should include breast cancer, and we should think about the impacts of incarceration, not just crime, but what that means for communities and families, right? And so if we think something's missing, if we don't have everybody in the room, that's another reason that you want to have more women in politics. So we're not suggesting the best reason to have women in politics is it will teach young girls that they belong in politics. And in fact, we don't even want those young girls in politics just to be in politics. What we're saying is one of the impacts out of many is that they're also sort of challenging our idea about who politics is for. Certainly this is true. There are similar studies that look at the impacts of having more elected officials of color, for example, that might be meaningful. Dave and I both live in South Bend, Indiana. Thinking about LGBTQ representation, our former mayor was the first gay member of a cabinet, right? All those sorts of things. With women, though, we're talking about a tradition going back thousands of years that, like, women don't belong in politics. This is men's business. And so it's going to take a lot to sort of challenge those really fundamental ideas in our culture.
If I could add, I think another practical point that both parties, all parties, I guess, even third parties, should take into account, while our book focuses on whether or not you get engaged in politics, and we take the students or the young people's partisan identity as a given, it's not much of a stretch to think that if you got excited about Hillary Clinton or Kamala Harris, and that's what brought you into politics as a young person, you probably have a loyalty or an identification with their party. And so if a party wants to ensure that the rising generation is going to identify with that party and support them consistently, well, running prominent women for office might actually be a way to ensure that you're holding on to at least the young women who will soon be of voting age.
Right. And that goes to sort of the disparity that we see among the political parties, right? When it comes to women running and women holding office of, I think there's 94 Democratic women in the House and 31 Republicans. You're not going to get to gender parity without more Republican women running and winning, right?
So we have a whole chapter. One of the constant questions in this research is this an effect of women in general, or is this an effect of Democratic women? Because so many of the candidates and office holders, as you just said, since 92 have been Democrats. We are able to use a survey experiment in which we tell young people, this was a historic year for Republican women. More of them ran than ever before, which happened to be true in 2020 when we did this experiment.
Right.
And so, because we don't lie to people when we do surveys, that's a no-no. And the people who saw that information, the Republican girls, you'll notice we didn't say Republican girls became more engaged in politics. We only said Democratic girls. But when we sort of created this other universe and really got them to think about, oh, lots of Republican women are running. And again, it was a historic year for Republican women. They also became more interested in being engaged. And so certainly both parties, to the extent that they want to build their voter bases, this is an important aspect. And we've heard a lot of that from young people about disappointed that there aren't more younger people like them who are running for office and can represent the interests that they see.
If I could, I'm sure we'll get to more questions, but I just happened to see in the chat that Marlene has asked a question about the way we presented women candidates in our research, and she's asking, did we use stock photos or real women? And it actually depends on which research question we're answering. We have a lot of data in this book. So Christina just described some survey experiments. So that's where somebody's in a survey context, we're presenting them with a news story and getting their reaction so we can control what's in the story. But most of the book is actually not like that. Most of the book is actually a study of what is happening in the wild. And we're not presenting images of the women candidates to the young people. We are just surveying them, and we know whether or not they live in a place where women have run or not. And so we can use that information because we know whether they're Democrats or Republicans. We know how close the election was, that sort of thing, to help us understand how the presence of those women might be changing the attitudes of those young people.
Let me get to a question from Carolyn. She says, do you think these findings are translatable to other minority groups? And could this book and these findings be seen as an advocate for more and better representation overall?
Dave, why don't you?
Yes and yes. So other minority groups, as we mentioned, one of the questions that we do look at in the book is, what if it's not just a woman running, but a woman of color? And how does that affect the attitudes of young people of color, but also white young people? And I'll just mention that we have been working on this for a long time. We've given a lot of lectures and a lot of presentations about our research. And that was the question we would always get every time we'd give a presentation. People would want to know, well, what happens if you have an intersectional identity? And up until the work on this book, we could never answer that question because we didn't really have the data that enabled us to do it. And now we do, and we think that's actually exciting that we can show that it's the effect, the role model effect that we describe is accentuated, especially for young people of color when it is a woman of color running. Although, as Christina noted, actually white girls, they also get engaged when they see a woman of color running. So that's race. Christina also alluded to something we don't test in the book, but would be a reasonable extension of our theory. And that is, well, what happens if somebody from another underrepresented group runs, a member of the LGBTQ community, for example? Would we expect to see a similar role model effect? And we would. In fact, we would welcome the opportunity to test that, or we would call on other scholars to try to test that where they can. And as there are more LGBTQ candidates running, there will be opportunities to do that.
Let's see, here's a question from Candace. Do you think the SAVE Act hurdles to voter registration are going to have a meaningful impact on the trend of more women in office?
So in my other life, when I'm not studying role models with Dave, I've written extensively on women's suffrage. And this issue about needing your birth certificate to match your identification, et cetera, is enormously important to thinking about before we even get to running for office, women's ability to vote. I will admit there are so many fires all at once that I have not followed this as closely as I should. But something like 75 to 80% of women change their names when they get married. And so we're talking about making voting more difficult for a large number of women. We know, look, there's an election, there's a lot going on in your life. You've got your job, you've got your family. The couch looks really nice. There's interesting new stuff on Netflix, right? There's, there's all sorts of things to do other than remember on election day to go down to your election place and cast your ballot, right? So stopping people from voting is really not that hard. And so if I'm now imagining I have to go get my birth certificate wherever it is, or I kept it, or I've moved or whatever, and then the name is different on it because I changed my name when I got married and I have to go through those hassles. Lots of women will still show up and go through those hassles. But some of them will just think, oh, it doesn't really matter. I'm just not going to go today, right? It doesn't take much to have a measurable impact on turnout.
Right.
Now, we have seen this. I also want to make one other point. So what happens when these things happen, and we've seen this on various restrictions that we know are particularly heavy on Black or Hispanic Americans. What happens is Black and historic organizations rally. They do education campaigns. They bring voters to the voting places. They, all these sorts of things. And so we actually don't see a measurable impact. And you might say, well, then it's a success. It's great. But I guess I would ask you, if they didn't have to help their constituents do this very basic thing of voting, what could they be doing with their energy if they were not organizing, voter buses or helping people get past ID problems? They could probably address other problems in their community, that those women's rights groups could work on other issues that impact women. And so there are costs there, I think, however we cut it.
Yeah, and also related to that, it's one thing to have that sort of effort during a presidential race or even a senatorial race where there's a lot of attention and a lot of money in the election. But what about a school board race? Or
Yeah.
a council race? Much
ballot initiative or anything.
Yep.
Much less likely to have that kind of mobilization effort.
Yeah. Kathy has raised an interesting comment that I wanted to peg a question off of. She's from Massachusetts, and she said she was inspired by Mayor Wu, the first female mayor in Boston, of course, that had her baby on her shoulder testifying in Washington and standing up to Trump's immigration policy. And of course, first female governor and first female lieutenant governor and AG, auditor, go Massachusetts, right? But I guess pegged onto that is the imagery, because you did talk about visibility, the imagery of women elected officials leaning into a component of their gender, bringing their baby. Like, is there role modeling that you think would go into that, just in terms of, 30 years ago, you would not have seen that, right? And now women elected officials are more comfortable doing that. You see campaign commercials now of like the mom running in the minivan with the kids in the back seat. Again, 30 years ago, you wouldn't see that, of leaning more into their gender.
Also, can remind me if I have this wrong, but Michelle Wu was also running against a woman, right? It was two women that ran for the mayoral race in Boston. Am I correct?
Somebody knows.
Somebody would know. I don't know if that's the case.
I believe that is right. Anyway,
okay.
But that itself is remarkable. I used to live in Boston, and
there's so many now women on women races, right? I mean, we're getting ready to have one in Virginia on the off-year election, right? We've got two women that are there's going to be the first woman governor of Virginia elected in this November, right?
I teach a class called Gender Politics and Power.
Yeah.
One of the ways I kick off every class to get us sort of talking and thinking is what I call a moment of gender. So I show a video or a picture or something, and a lot of them are campaign ads.
Yeah.
And boy, has that changed in the last 10 years, right? I'm forgetting Teach Out's first name, but when she ran for mayor, she did a picture of, she was like literally having an ultrasound during the exam. There have been more than one candidate now who has breastfed during a campaign ad. I believe one woman had video of herself giving birth, right? Like we are really leaning into not just gender, but very traditional ideas about gender, right? Now, I think when we think about those representations, we also think about women leaning into gender, into the woman thing, right? And certainly there's interesting things to talk about how much Republican versus Democratic women do those sorts of things. I think most of the ads I think about, as opposed to say Kay Ivey in Alabama, who has an ad where she's shooting a gun, right? Which is she's doing some different sort of, coming up against gender. But I guess I would also say it's important to think that men candidates also lean into masculinity or not, right? And so in the last 20 years, we've seen both the Instagram accounts with the playing with the kids and the being a good dad sort of thing, which, short of John Kennedy with his kids in the Oval Office, right, was not very common. And men, my students do papers on these sorts of things. My US Senator in a tight black shirt standing in front of the wall in Texas, right? That's masculinity. That's sort of strength. And so we live in an interesting time in which women have so many more opportunities than they've had before, but also a time in which there's a great deal of conflict over gender roles. And so this idea that where motherhood used to be, oh, how can you run for office if you have children, that women now see that as part of the argument for why they would be, I understand what it's like to be a mother. I care about children, right? I think says a lot about sort of the changing role of gender and of women's roles in our politics. We were really struck that Nikki Haley really was doing outreach, emphasizing that she was a woman in ways that we don't always see from Republican candidates, in ways that were different than Hillary Clinton. Kamala Harris also, the way that she dealt with gender was different than Clinton, different than Nikki Haley, et cetera. And so this really is a choice that most candidates have to make about, as they present themselves as a person, how is gender part of that presentation?
Let's see. Here's another question. What barriers do you think might limit the effectiveness of women politicians as role models in changing societal attitudes toward gender and leadership? So barriers.
Oh, I'm sure Dave will think of things as well. I think one is those stereotypes still exist. And that some of the ways in which gender is used in politics, right? The same argument that women bring a new perspective, women are more honest and trustful and they can reach across the aisle, also sets very high expectation for women candidates. And so we know, for example, around the world that women who get into a scandal are sort of punished more harshly than men. I often think of the locker up and Hillary Clinton, right? Hillary Clinton has mostly behaved like every other male politician in her career, but the sort of criminalizing of that. That if women aren't reaching across the aisle, if they're not a certain kind of advocate for women, or if they're not compassionate or don't have children, or whatever it might be, they don't fulfill this new model we have of this activist mother politician, that they're going to be punished. And so I wouldn't say that it's that, there are more options for women, but there's still a lot of landmines.
Yeah, I would add to that. We see less of this today than we did in the past, but it's still worth noting. Christina noted that one of the key factors for the effects we find is that a woman is running a viable campaign. And we do see examples of women who are running for one of these visible offices, but they are, as Christina noted earlier, a sacrificial lamb.
Right.
And so if a party has a nominee for one of these prominent positions who is never going to win, never gets any media coverage, certainly that's not going to have the effects that we're describing, and it might actually be a step backward because all you do is see women lose by a landslide. It's not reinforcing the idea that this is a viable option for people to pursue.
I was just thinking of, we've seen in recent weeks, some of these huge rallies that AOC and Bernie Sanders are having around the country, tens of thousands of people coming out to him. And I'm curious about her specifically, because she's someone that is obviously of a younger generation. She speaks to younger women. She's very accessible on social media. Her as a role model, I guess, do you see a difference in sort of the actual role model as being relatable? In other words, does a younger, hipper, cooler candidate resonate with young women more than an older, traditional kind of a candidate? Anything there?
Well, I noticed that one of our questions was about the future of this field of research. What would our vision be? And I would put that at the top of the agenda of things to study. So in our book, we don't compare older women candidates versus younger women candidates. Is there a difference? Frankly, there probably wouldn't be enough women candidates to say anything meaningful about that distinction. But the point you make about someone like AOC, I think, is a very good one, especially since we are interested in these impressionable years. And everything you say makes perfect sense, that being a young, relatable candidate may be different than being your sort of more traditional middle-aged candidate running in a more conventional way. Because I mean, AOC is also all about using social media and memes.
Right. Yeah.
We do have some clues from the literature, especially out of psychology. Probably everyone's aware of, all this literature on role models in the STEM professions, et cetera, that What does it mean that you are exposed to a woman professor in fields that are really dominated by men, engineering, business, math, et cetera? And that research has looked at this question, right? And so one of the issues is, right, I might see the record-breaking woman tennis player, Serena Williams, and think, that's amazing, but that is unreachable. That is, I can't identify with her at all. She had all this background, all these opportunities. But it might be that if in my own community, or whatever it might be, there's a woman who is breaking barriers in some other ways, I can kind of see a path to that. And it is important to say that while we look at ambition, we're not just interested in, do I look at Serena Williams and think I can be the best tennis player in the world? Or do I look at Serena Williams and say, my model of women includes someone with muscles and speed and power, right? And that's sort of closer to how we're thinking about it. It's not that you look and you think, I saw AOC, I can be this path-breaking member of Congress, shape the future, et cetera. But rather you're thinking like, you can be conventionally attractive and young and have a different background than lots of politicians. You've worked in a bar, you've done these sorts of things, and still be really informed about politics, still be a woman. And that, I think, is where her power really lies, is making, you and I, if you Google professor or politician cartoon or something, there's still these really strong stereotypes, but people like AOC are really, I have no patches on my
we do not have
jacket
flannel. Yeah, do we not have like the plaid jacket and a cigar and like our pipe and a hat?
I would say I was going to have a pipe, but I thought that was a bit.
Dave might, though. He might have patches. I don't know.
But so Christina, you're the mother of Jane and Ella. And so I loved the call out at the end of the book, and I'm a mom of an Ella too. So you call out of suggestions on how your next book can have the name Ella in a title, since Jane has caught this one.
So my daughter Ella was born in 2004, and Dave and I published our first article, which was also called Who Jane's Run. See Jane Run, I know the name of our book, in 2006. And then my Jane was born in 2007. And the first time I talked to Dave after that, he said, I'm only going to ask you this once. Did you name your daughter after our article? I want the record to show that I did not. That's very important. So yes, my daughter's name is on the cover of this book. And so I also dedicated it to my older daughter, Ella, because Jane got the cover. We had a book launch here at Notre Dame, and the outside speaker came and talked. Had also seen that comment in the acknowledgments, and she suggested if we got the book translated into Spanish, She Runs would be Ella. I should know the Spanish word for runs, but that we might be able, the Spanish version, and my daughter speaks.
There you go. Okay, good.
Would have Ella in it, so that may save me from whatever internal family conflict I have drummed up by this.
I love it. Well, I'm all in favor of more Ellas in the title, so that's a good one. So thank you both so much for spending your evening with us. The book is terrific. We have links in the chat, of course, if anyone anyone wants to buy that. Check out your website, etc., and keep us posted on your incredible research. And really appreciate you joining us and everybody else for tuning in tonight as well. So thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. And I apologize to those questions we weren't able to get to, but we have read them. We're processing them. If you want to follow up, feel free to do so.
And if you want to know if young people really are Democrats or Republicans, we talk about that at some length in the book. So thank you for that question too.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you.
Here.